before you can know where you're going, you've got to know where you are. Now, I recognize that's a very elementary statement to make, but it is true. There are people who I know who have difficulty arriving at any kind of destination or arriving at any kind of goal that they have set in their lives because they've never taken the time to stop and take inventory and see where they are right now. I don't know what you do when you go to a mall, but I don't wander around aimlessly. I think most men, we go for a purpose and then we get what we need and we're out of there. First of all, I don't really like to go to the mall. I always tend to go find, that mall map and at all the entrances and figured out where it is that I need to go, so I'm not just wandering around trying to figure things out. So, and every mall map says the same things. They all say the same thing. There's 3 words on every single mall map, and it says, "You are here." So now I know where I'm at. Now I need to know where I'm going. So what I'm saying to you this morning is that it's never out of order. It's always in order. To evaluate our lives and to assess where we are in relationship to where I need to be. That's true physically in life, but it's also true in our spiritual condition before God. We must constantly be asking ourselves questions. We need to ask ourselves, am I making progress as a Christian? Or have I become rather stagnant in my spiritual life? Where would I be on the map? Where would I be? Where would it say, "You are here"? Am I utilizing the tools that are available to me to help motivate me as a Christian? Or have I become rather lazy and I don't pray like I should? I don't read my Bible like I should. And if I have any kind of excuse, well, it keeps me from assembling with God's people regularly. Am I handling trouble and stressful situations in my life? Or am I allowing those things to handle me? Am I walking by faith or am I walking by sight? Where am I in all of that? We need to ask those questions. And a lot of people never ask them because a lot of people think the fault always lies with everybody else. It's everybody else's fault. It's not my fault. It's your fault. Well, we not only need to ask those questions individually, but we need to ask those questions congregationally as well. Are we where we need to be as a church? Are we working to support each other and encourage one another? Are we working hard to understand each other and to reach out to one another? Are we warm to our visitors? Are we friendly to newcomers? Are we growing warmer through fellowship? Are we growing stronger through biblical teaching? I'm saying to you this morning, before you know where you're going, you have got to know where you are. That's true, again, of each one of us individually, but it's true of us as a whole as well. But I'll tell you something else you've got to know. You've got to know that every single Christian is a vital part of God's plan for this church. There is not one single person that is insignificant. Not one. Everybody's important. Everyone has a contribution to make and a role to fill. Take your Bible and look at Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, notice what it says in verses 12 and 13. Philippians chapter 2, as Eli read for moments ago, Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 12. Therefore, my dear friends, just as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but even more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is working in you, both to will and to work according to his good purpose. If that passage is saying anything at all, it's saying that God uses people. He uses people like you and me. He uses us to accomplish his work in this world. Some people have a notion that God's going to send forth the salvation message, that God is going to preach the gospel, that God is going to save the lost, that God is going to grow the church through some kind of gifted and maybe talented program. Well, it all falls on the shoulders of elders. It falls on the shoulders of deacons, or it falls on the shoulder of Bible class teachers or preachers. It's their job. The people who are out in front, the visible ones. If I sit amongst everybody else and I keep to myself, I'm insignificant. I don't really have to do anything. And that's just not the case. I'm going to tell you, nobody is insignificant. If you're a child of God and a dedicated follower of Jesus, this passage is saying that God's going to do his work in this world through you. Through you. He will use you to make a difference in a world that needs a difference. So let me show you an example of that. Take out your Old Testament. Go back to Numbers chapter 13. We're going to go to the book of Numbers, chapter 13. What you have in Numbers chapter 13 is an example of two men who understood this. Here were two men who allowed God to work in their lives to do something that everybody else said was an impossibility. Now, before we get into the text there in Numbers chapter 13, let's state the facts and kind of set the stage. There are 5 facts. Number 1, there's been an exodus. God's people have been in bondage down in the land of Egypt. God has appeared to Moses in the burning bush. And he said, you go down and you tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And so Moses did. And Pharaoh let them go. Reluctantly, but he did. He let them go. And so there's been an exodus. But then secondly, the people arrive at the edge of the promised land. Under the leadership of Moses and the mighty hand of God in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 16, they arrive at the border. And it took a lot just to get there. There was the Exodus itself. There was the crossing of the Red Sea. There was the various miracles that God did in their presence. And then there was the day after day after day travel that was not easy. And finally you get to the end of chapter 12 and they finally made it. They got to the edge of the promised land. Third, the new land was their claim. In Numbers chapter 13, the very beginning of verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, send men to scout out the land of Canaan I am giving to the Israelites. Send one man who is a leader among them from each of their ancestral tribes. Notice God is saying, this is your land. This is your land. This is your home. I'm going to give it to you. Now he says that you're going to have to plan it. He says that I want you to do the invasion, and I want you to go fight for it, but I guarantee you victory. Think about that. I'm guaranteeing you victory. No army ever had it better than they did. They knew going into battle that they were going to win. But then fourth, God commanded that they send men out to spy out the land. And I've always wondered why. Why? Why did God want to do that? God said that I'm going to give it to you. It's yours, but so why does he say go spy out the land? Well, there's a principle that runs throughout all of Scripture. And that principle is that God does not do for man what man can do for himself. You notice that? God does not do for man what man can do for himself. When Jesus came to the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus comes to the tomb of Lazarus and he turns to the men and he says, roll away the stone. Well, who said that? Well, the Son of God said that. The man who is about to raise somebody from the dead said that. The creator of the world said that. And Jesus stands there and he looks around at those people who were standing around him and he says, you roll away the stone. Couldn't he do it? Jesus could have done it. Jesus could have spoke it and that stone would have rolled. But he didn't. Because God does not do for man what man can do for himself. Man could roll that stone away. And so he had them roll it away. That's why Jesus turns to the apostles and the Lord turns to you and to me and he says, you go preach the gospel. You do it. You go preach the word. And I'll give you the increase. I will. But you have to do your part. God says, you do your part, I'll do my part. And so he says, I'm going to give you the land, but you go scope it out. So the assignment was clear. If you drop down to verse 17, Numbers chapter 13, when Moses sent them to scout out the land of Canaan, he told them, go up this way to the Negev, then go up into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. Is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous. Bring back some fruit from the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. Did you notice that? The assignment, ladies and gentlemen, is very simple. But it says they were gone for 40 days. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 21, so they went up and scouted out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob, near the entrance of Hamath. Verse 23, when they came to Eshcol valley, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, which was carried on a pole by 2 men. They also took some pomegranates and figs. Verse 25, at the end of 40 days, they returned from scouting out the land. The men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report for them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, we went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruit. So they're gone for 40 days, and they come back, and they gather all the people together, and they give the report. And it was a good report. And they told about how beautiful it was there, and they talked about the fruit of the land and the produce of the land. And they even showed some examples that they had brought back with them of how great it was. And the people, they're all standing around, are oohing and eyeing as only you can imagine them doing. Oh, those look delicious. Those look wonderful. And one word changed everything. One word. There in verse 28. The people were getting enthused. The people were getting excited. They were caught up in the moment. And the momentum of the occasion was destroyed by one word. But. Look at all they did. They talked to the people. They showed the people. They built them up. And then turned right around and said, but. Or nevertheless. In verse 28. However, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it. And you feel like saying to them, that's not your job. That's not your job to say those things. Verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him responded, We can't attack the people because they are stronger than we are. That is not your job. Nobody asked you to go and to come back and give your opinion on whether or not you could take the land. That was not your job. You were never asked to do that. Verse 32 and 33. So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land that they had scouted. The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. To ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed the same to them. You would not believe the size of these soldiers. They are huge. We can't do this. There's no way we can do this. Now, what kind of impact do you think that sort of negative thinking had on the people? At first, they were amazed at the stuff that they brought back and thought, man, this is great, this is wonderful. And then they say, but they've got some big, big soldiers. I don't think we can do this. Well, negative thinking and people who have that mindset that we can't do this, I'll tell you right now, it's contagious. It's contagious. If one person were to say, this congregation at Lake Wales is never going to grow, it's just not. Nobody cares in this community anymore. That can be contagious. And before you know it, others are thinking it. And others are feeling the same way. And so now it's, what's the use? God said, you go preach the word, I will give the increase. It is not our job to say, why go preach the word because they're not going to listen. It's not our job. Our job is to go and preach. You think the flu is contagious. It is nothing compared to what a few negative people can do in a church. Notice the response. Chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. Then the whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. All the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron, and the whole community told them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why don't you just leave us alone? Let's just stay here on this side of Jordan. Let's just forget. Let's forget about this promised land. Let's forget about Canaan. There were 2 men that day who heard all of that. 2. And they stepped forward. 2 out of the 12 who had the courage, who faced all of those negative doubters who said, oh, we can't do this. Those 2 men stepped forward and they said, yes, we most certainly can. Joshua and Caleb. And they basically said, y'all need to stop this. Stop all of this. Stop the negative talk. There's another side to this. There's something greater at stake than all of this. Again, don't you remember that God promised us this land? It's a promise. He just happens to be the same God who brought us out of Egypt. And nobody thought he could ever do that. And then we got to the Red Sea. And don't you remember, you were scared because you thought the Egyptians were going to kill us all? And then you witnessed God's power as he parted the sea, and we walked across on dry land. And then there were all of the other miracles that he did. We've got to have faith, is what Joshua and Caleb are saying. We have got to have faith. We've got to believe. We've got to see the vision of what God can do. That's in verses 7 through 9. Let's look at verses 8 and 9. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us into this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and give it to us. Only don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. There were 10 men who saw the problem, and there were only 2 men who saw the solution. There were 10 men who saw all of the obstacles. Only 2 men saw the answers. 10 men who were impressed with the size of the giants, and there were 2 men who had the courage to step forward and say, wait a minute. They might be big guys, but look at the size of our God. We know the rest of the story. The people listened to the majority, and they lost their faith, and they lost their courage. They lost their families, and they eventually lost their lives. Well, what's this all about? What's this all about? Do you understand that the key to spiritual success is vision? I'll tell you what vision is. Vision is the ability to see God's presence and to see God's power, and to focus in on God's plan in spite of all of the obstacles. I'll tell you that all 12 spies were intelligent men. In fact, Moses had given the order that they weren't to choose just anybody. They were to choose 12 leaders. 12 of the leaders of Israel, and only leaders. But out of those leaders, only 2 men had the vision of what God wanted. I think about Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 18. It says, where there is no vision, the people perish. You see, we're not just blowing dust off of old history here. We're talking about what needs to be done now. We're talking about what needs to be done today. Because there's always, in any age, there's always obstacles in the way of progress. Always. There will always be opposition. There will always be people who say it can't be done. There will always be people who are comfortable camping over in the wilderness who never have faith in God to cross the Jordan and take the promised land. There will always be those people. But Joshua and Caleb didn't buy it. I don't buy it. You shouldn't buy it. I hope that there's enough people here in this congregation to say with Joshua and to say with Caleb, let's hang it on the odds. Let's hang it on the odds. Hang it on the obstacles. Hang it upon what anybody might say that's anything negative. We're taking God exactly for what God said. And we're going to cross the Jordan. We're taking what God said about go and preach the gospel. And we're going to do that. And we're going to let him do his job, and that is to provide the increase. That's the attitude that God wants us to have. And that's the attitude he's always wanted his people to have. That's the attitude that we have to have. And so how hungry are you spiritually? How hungry are you? Do you see a church that's hungry? Do you see a church that's talented? Do you see a church of great potential? Do you see a church that if we just work together, we're going to have a whole new set of problems? And that is where people come in and we think, where are we going to put these people? We don't have enough room. That's a good problem to have. It's about time to have faith in God and understand that with him all things are possible. But you've got to believe that. And it's easy to look at ourselves and say, well, we're just ordinary people. I'm just a regular guy. I'm just ordinary. But what is it going to take to get people to understand? That's who God uses. That's who he's always used. You realize that? He used a ruddy, complected shepherd boy named David to stand and face down the Philistine army. He used a teenager by the name of Daniel to teach the most powerful man in the world a lesson about sovereignty. He used a widow by the name of Naomi to lead her daughter-in-law to the true God. And that's no small thing, because that girl went on to get married and have a baby who just happened to be in the lineage of Jesus. He used a stuttering 80-year-old shepherd named Moses to lead his people. He used an insignificant man by the name of Gideon who said that, Lord, who am I to do this? Who am I? And God said, Gideon, I want you to take an army of 300 men, and I want you to go out and defeat the great army of the Midianites. And he did. Ordinary guy. He used a farm boy named Amos, who couldn't hardly speak any words of great communication. He was not diplomatic at all. But Amos just took what he had and he went out and preached the word and became one of the greatest preachers in the Old Testament. You want to see ordinary? I think about the apostles. Jesus took those fishermen and he took a tax collector by the name of Matthew, and he converted Zacchaeus and a couple of lepers and a handful of women. And he took those people and he made them into a movement that went out and changed the entire world. Who are we to say that I'm just an ordinary person? That's who God uses. He uses regular, ordinary people. God has not changed. He has not changed from that. He uses people like us. But I'll tell you a secret. If you're waiting for somebody to ride in here on a white horse and do everything, it's not going to happen. Joshua and Caleb couldn't do it all by themselves. They couldn't. They needed the support. They needed encouragement. And it's the same today. It's the same today. I'll tell you something else. Sometimes there's a lot of people that the preacher can't reach because people put up barriers with preachers. They do. Some people act weird around preachers. You know, if they find out that I preach, it's like all of a sudden they're like, I can't tell a joke. Preachers aren't supposed to laugh, are they? Right? And they get kind of weird. There was a story about a kid who didn't realize the preacher had come, and he was sitting in the living room, and he was visiting with his parents. And the kid, he didn't see the preacher. He didn't know that the preacher was in the living room with his parents. He came rushing in, and he was holding a dead rat. And he said, "Look, Mom, I smashed it with a baseball bat. I threw it at the rocks. I stomped on his head. I crushed it." And he looks over and he sees the preacher sitting there, and his next words were, "But the Lord called him home." See, that's how people are around preachers. Violent, and then, but the Lord called him home. People act weird sometimes around preachers. And so when I read in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 13 that God says, I'm going to do my work in the world through you, it's not written to preachers. It's not written to elders. It's not written to deacons. It is written to every single Christian. Every single one of us. And so are the next two verses in Philippians chapter 2. And I'll close with this. Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Do everything without grumbling and arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world. He says that my people are to be lights in the world. Let's do that. In fact, let's crank up the voltage. Let's all realize that the future is here and now. The Lord will work through you. You have to let him. You know, thank God for people like Joshua and Caleb, who understood that when you walk with God, you can make a difference in a world where there needs to be a difference. If you're here this morning and you have not yet obeyed the gospel of Christ, you've been given the opportunity. You are here. God has blessed you with the opportunity to be here, and has given you an opportunity to obey his word and to become a child of God? Have you been baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins? If you have not, you need to ask why not. And if you need to study more, let's sit down and study, and let's not put it off. Because as we talked about this morning in our Bible class, the Lord can return at any moment. We have our evening service tonight at 5 p.m. We're going to come back here at 5 p.m. We're going to have a worship, but you know what? We may not make it here. The Lord may return. He may return before we have a chance to worship him this evening. We don't know that. Our life could end. We don't know that. That's why we need to be ready. So we all need to ask ourselves at this moment, if the Lord were to return, am I ready? If the answer is no, then you need to make some changes. If you have a need, we ask that you make a note, and as together we stand and sing the invitation.